afternoon. My name is Charlotte, Wisconsin Van Cleve, and it is the year of our Lord, 1870, that I welcome you to my home here on 5th Street Southeast in St. Anthony, the oldest part of Minneapolis. I, of course, live there with my husband, Colonel Horatio Van Cleve, our 12 children, and Bessie the horse. Bessie's the most popular of all of us. The story behind Bessie is also the story behind my husband. They signed up for the Union Army during the war between the states. They went off to battle. I worried, and then I heard they were both injured. They came back. They have recovered. My children are so happy, and so am I. Speaking of children, I was the very first white baby in Minnesota. Yes, it's a long story, and a long life. But it all began in Michigan. We were still Michigan territory at this time, but back in the state of Michigan, my father had signed up with the military regiment that was sent out to build Fort Snelling. And so all the families went along, and my mother found out she was in the family way. They crossed Lake Michigan. They went up the Fox River. They went down the Wisconsin River. And then I was born, which is why my middle name is Wisconsin. So down in Prairie du Chien, we loaded up the keel boats with food, but there wasn't very much of it. And it took many weeks to get up the Mississippi River. You know, on keel boat, they're flat, they carry a lot, and they barely move. Week after week, they would be poling us until finally we arrived at the confluence of the Mississippi River and the Minnesota River. It used to be called the St. Peters River when we came. We looked around, and there were several Dakota villages there on both sides of both rivers. There was a big one called Kaposia, which is right down near present-day St. Paul across. And then there was one way out by Lake Harriet. That was White Cloud's village. And then near the confluence, there was another village. So winter came on. We did not have a lot of food, and it was a ferocious winter. It was so ferocious that the blizzard winds blew the roof off of our cabin. Well, I was a baby, so I don't remember, but they tell me this. And the sad part was that half of the soldiers died from scurvy, lack of nutrition, like on board ship. It was a hard time. And as spring came and the ground melted, the Dakota women were able to dig up a root they called the spignut root. And they brought this root over to us, and it stopped the scurvy. And we've been grateful ever since. Our camp surgeon learned a lot from that. Oh! Ingrid and Mabel, wherever you are, please tend to the door. I think we have guests.
Good day, ma'am. What is your name?
Mrs. Julia Nelson.
It's Miss Julia Nelson, ma'am, from Wedway.
Oh,
Here,
yes!
Let me show you where to sit.
Mrs. Nelson, how delightful.
Oh.
I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Mrs. Van Cleve. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to see you, and thank you for your kind invitation.
Absolutely. I read about you in the newspaper.
Oh,
You are an active person.
Thank you, I am.
Yes.
I understand.
Feel free to have a seat.
Thank you. I understand that Mrs. Bella French and Mrs. Emily Gray will be joining us this afternoon.
You are correct, and it will be quite the discussion. I thought you might enjoy that.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
So tell me about your trip. Did you come by steamboat?
No, I took the new railway for the first time.
Oh,
Yes, it is considerably faster than steamboat. Have you tried it?
I did try it once. Very loud and smoky. I prefer the steamboat. Yes, yes. Oh, excuse me. So I have here my companions and helpers for the day. Two young women from Bethany House. It's Ingrid and Mabel.
Good day, ma'am. Miss Van Cleve brought us with her today to help at the party.
And it's a tea party. We are so excited. We've never been to a tea party before.
Oh, how lovely. Pleasure to meet you both.
So this is Mrs. Julia Nelson, as you heard at the door. So thank you for coming. I want to tell you that I've read some of your writings on temperance, prohibition of alcohol. At first, I wondered if that was a good idea, and I do believe I finally understand. But do tell me if I have this correct. So, men, that this is an issue for women.
Yes.
And working men, after a hard day, they want to go to the tavern after that day,
Yes.
spend too much of their family's money, drink too much alcohol,
Yes.
and by the time they arrive home, brutalize their wives and children.
Unfortunately, that is all correct.
Well, if this is the best way for us to stop this horrid practice that is happening in the homes of these women, then I am in favor of it. Yes. Speaking of families, I'm told you live with your mother, and how is she?
I do. She's doing quite well. I am back here with her for a while. And fortunately, Mrs. Martha Miller will stay on with her when I leave. Martha Miller is a freed slave from Tennessee, and she is a godsend to my mother.
Oh my goodness.
I spend most of my year teaching freed slaves in Tennessee.
So, well, you can call me Charlotte, if I can call you Julia.
Oh, yes.
Good. But I don't understand. Why did you teach so far away?
Well, let me share about that, Charlotte.
Would you?
Yes, certainly. I was a young woman when we arrived from Connecticut, my mother and father and I. My parents were Quakers who believed God created everyone equal, no matter their color. My mother openly bordered Southern black migrants in our house for years. And I attended Hamlin University in Red Wing, Minnesota, and I was the first woman to graduate with a teaching degree. I taught in Minnesota and Connecticut, and then I married Ole Nelson. Oh, my dear Ole. It was just after the war between the states. Then we had our son, Cyrus. And then Cyrus died, and my husband too, within 6 months. It was as if God was testing me, like Job in the Bible. Have you ever had a truly terrible thing happen to you? If so, you might understand that in order to help yourself heal from those things, it's good to help others that are going through terrible times as well. As a result, I signed up with the Freedmen's Bureau to teach reading to freed slaves in Texas and then Tennessee. I actually recently just returned from teaching in Texas. There are now many teachers from the northern states teaching freed slaves in the southern states. And this has given me a new purpose. Oh, now, Mrs. Van Cleve, would you please tell us about Bethany House? What is that?
Well, Bethany House, as you know, the girls are from there. Bethany House is a home for unwed mothers. I am one of the sisters of Bethany, along with Mrs. Abby Mendenhall and Mrs. Harriet Walker, who has since started a hospital. We looked around and we noticed a terrible problem. there were young women coming from Norway and Germany and Sweden with high hopes for a new life. They would come and become hired girls. They would be maids. They would be cooks. But they were unprotected. And when they were there, surrounded by strange men, they often became in the family way. And we feel it is no fault of their own most of the time. But what happened is their employers would banish them. So they were having their babies in alleys and barns. The babies might die, the mothers occasionally did as well. We just had to do something. So we built Bethany House, and we keep expanding it because it's such a problem.
Yes.
The girls come for an entire year. They have their babies, they learn skills, and gradually they and their babies gain in strength.
Wonderful.
Oh, Ingrid and Mabel, I think we need you to tend to the door. Thank you.
Good day, ma'am. What is your name?
Mrs. Bella French.
It's Mrs. Bella French, ma'am, from St. Paul.
Oh, hi.
Come here.
Mrs. Van Cleve.
Mrs. French. Lovely to see you.
Yes.
Yes.
I am sorry I am late. Someone an angry reader broke into the newspaper.
Oh.
I had to wait for another publisher to come before I could catch the next horse trolley before I could come here.
So as you notice, Miss Bella French is a writer and publisher. She's currently a journalist at the St. Paul Pioneer Press, correct?
Yes.
And Mrs. Julia Nelson is a teacher and temperance worker from Red Wing. Yes, and welcome to both of you.
Yes, I have just moved to St. Paul, and I feel that I am in the center of all things change. I'm currently working at the St. Paul Chronotype, a literary magazine, and I have been traveling up and down the Mississippi by steamboat for quite a while. I had my own newspaper in Brownsville, just south of La Crosse. And while I was working there, I was also writing for the Daily La Crosse Democrat.
You are the busiest woman around.
Yes, and I want to thank you for your recent interview that you gave me for my new magazine that I'm working on, the American Sketchbook. It will be filled with all things new for the history of the Northwest. Yes, yes.
She is a whirlwind, and I thank you for that interview.
Now-
It was a pleasure.
Yes. Now, girls, I want you to know that I also came from poverty. I had to sew and could not go to school. I had to teach myself to read. And I read everything I could get my hands on. So, I hope someday that you will be able to read things that I have written.
Mrs. French, you are so very inspiring. We will begin reading like you did.
Thank you so much for telling us your story. We must excuse ourselves to go to the kitchen.
Well, I just want to check. I am sure both of you have heard about the visits of our most famous suffragist from Albany, New York, Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Of course, yes.
Her 2 visits, to La Crosse and then to St. Paul. We were so honored. She began some of the very first suffrage societies here in our state, but even more, she set to work to convince the Minnesota legislature to allow women to vote. Now, the second trip, the legislature voted yes. The governor said he would sign it, that she could leave on the train. As soon as she left on the train, he canceled all those plans and repealed the law. Betrayal.
Yes, yes.
Oh,
I did have a chance to hear her speak.
you did?
I did, yes. And do you know what inspired her
No.
for what she was doing?
No.
Why? It was the New York Iroquois women.
Really?
Yes, I wrote about it in my article. Would you like me to read it?
Oh, you wrote it.
Of
Of
course.
course. Yes.
Brought it with me.
Yes.
Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony have traveled to Minnesota and encouraged us to start units of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Why bother, you ask? Perhaps you say that women have always been slaves to men because the Bible demands it. We ask you to fight for women's rights because we now know that women were created by God with equal rights and dignity. How do we know this? Elizabeth Stanton tells us that she learned it from the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee women in her home in upstate New York. This is what she learned. Iroquois women, for generations, have been heads of their families who created food and owned the home. Iroquois women have the power to elect chiefs and depose them. Iroquois women were priestesses and led their communities. This proves that God did not create women to be less than men, though the Bible may say that they are. Notable sisters help us to return to how God truly created us as powerful and respectable leaders of our families and our communities, our place of dignity.
This is amazing. Thank you. Thank you. No idea she felt that way. The tea is right. Excellent. Thank you, girls. Oh,
Hello, what is your name?
This is Emily Gray.
thank you.
St. Anne.
It's Miss Emily Gray from St. Anthony, ma'am.
Oh, oh my. Come have some tea, Mrs. Peck. I could offer this to you. Thank you. Mrs. Gray, lovely to see you. Yes, yes. Now, Mrs. Gray, I want to introduce you. So we have here Mrs. Julia Nelson, teacher and worker for Temperance as in Redmond. And this is Mrs. Emily Gray from here in St. Anne. And here we have Miss Bella French, yes, who is from St. Paul, yes, and our wonderful Mrs. Emily Gray is both abolitionist and civil rights worker and a fine dressmaker, and I do hope you're willing to fit me for a dress today, Mrs. Gray.
Hi, certainly.
Thank you.
It's such a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Gray. My mother and I have read all about you in the papers. I understand that you're a Congregationalist. My mother and I are Quakers, so I believe we agree a lot about civil justice.
That's why I've come. We are like-minded.
We are like that. Yes. Oh, Mrs. Gray, would you first tell us about your remarkable experience with helping the freed slave Eliza Winston? I know this was 10 years ago, but this story of bravery and peril is worth retelling. Would you mind sharing?
My husband, Mr. Gray, and I are abolitionists. We have worked a great many years to free the enslaved people before and during the war between the states. I was raised in a family where this was of most importance, as my father was enslaved as a child. I recall often seeing people hiding in our closets and in the attics, awaiting the Underground Railroad. My father was too well known for this back in York, Pennsylvania. He escaped just in time. He now lives with us. Ralph and I have 4 amazing children. We have William, named after my father. We have Toussaint Louverture, and we have Harriet, Martineau, and Banneker. All names of famous coloreds. Perhaps you know I have a dressmaking shop in the Winslow Hotel in St. Anthony. And my husband has a barber shop. One day, a woman came into the shop. Her name was Eliza. And Eliza Winston, she came to me, whispered in my ear that she needed help escaping to freedom. I was surprised. I was taken aback, as in 1860, Minnesota law prohibited slavery. So I knew the authorities they would support my actions. I reached out to the sheriff and a lawyer. I told them there was a family visiting from the South, the Christmas family, and they were holding her. On the day that Eliza was supposed to be in court, I was told that her captors had taken her. They had taken her to a cottage in Lake Harriet. I immediately reached out to the authorities. We rode horseback through the streets of St. Anthony, all the way to Lake Harriet. We got her. We took her to court. I sat in court and listened to her testify against her captors. Eliza won her freedom! Freedom is so sweet. So sweet. There was a mob outside of that courthouse. That same mob damaged our home and my shop. Ralph and I had to lay low for a while. Oh, we got the neighbors though. We got some of the kindest people, both colored and white. We considered moving to the countryside in Minneapolis. I don't know if you know this, but Frederick Douglass was in town to lecture. We hosted him in our home. Of course, the hotels rejected him. That gentleman has some of the sweetest words.
Yes, he was turned away in Winona as well. I'm beginning to understand where most of your courage and bravery comes from. When I teach former slaves in Tennessee, I must be very careful where I go and where I stay because of the former Confederate soldiers. I know a little about that fear of them, the Ku Klux we call them. But you defied those same people to their faces. You have such bravery and boldness. We need that bravery and boldness in women to help serve our country, our state. And we need women to be able to vote. Don't you agree? Yes, I recently gave a speech about that in Red Wing.
Did you?
I did.
So, perhaps you know about how hard we worked just recently to pass through the legislature just a little bit of a right to vote for school board. And so now in Minnesota you can vote for a school board. I decided to test this. So I ran as a candidate for my local school board, the first woman. And now Mrs. French tells me the latest news is that I won.
Congratulations, Clara. That is the best news I've had in weeks. You are bravely leading our fight for women's rights in Minnesota. Let's join in singing our women's suffrage anthem together.
Yes. The future has arrived.
Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. But the cause goes marching on.
Once more.
Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long.
Join us.
Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. But the cause goes marching on.
Once more, you know it.
Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. But the cause goes marching on.
Thank you for joining with us. You'll need to remember that song for our rally during intermission.
Ladies, forward. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long, but the cause goes marching on.
Ladies, prepare for speeches.
Greetings, everyone. I am Nanny Matson Yeager. Thank you for coming to our rally for women's rights. I bring you news. After 72 years of struggle, Congress is finally ready to change our Constitution to allow American women to be full citizens, to vote. We are so close to having 36 states ratify our 19th Amendment. To be part of the Constitution, we need only one more state. How long have we dreamed of this? Worked for this, sweated for this, ached for this. Thousands of women have worked for this. In Minnesota, it goes back to 1867, when Sarah Stearns from Rochester took the first action for full civil rights for women in Minnesota. We now have thousands of Minnesota women with us. Clara Euland organized our parade of 2,000 women down Hennepin Avenue. This was a miraculous sight. Today we come as strong Minnesota suffragists, ready to paint you a picture of this struggle. I'd like to introduce you to Minnesota's Moses of Women's Rights. This is Clara Euland.
Thank you. I just have to, did you tell them about the 30,000? We have 30,000 women joining in 6 different suffrage groups. Can you believe that? It is a wave. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in 1920, we are now at a crucial juncture for our state and our country. We are very close to finally passing this constitutional amendment. Our great-granddaughters will remember and cherish these days. Yes, don't let it slip by. Yes, I am Clara Euland, and I am the president of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. I have been this since 1914. A little bit about me. I came to Minnesota as a young, poor woman with a widowed mother. And you know, my guiding light was education. I became a teacher. I taught for several years. And then I married my husband, Andreas Euland, and had to quit teaching. Andreas had come alone from Norway as a young man. He was also poor, but he made his way up to the University of Minnesota, where he became a lawyer. He now defends women for their rights, and he is helping many, many people. We had a whole family, 6 children. They have grown, and since they have grown, I've finally been able to to literary societies, which I assume you are all familiar with. So a literary society is where the common woman goes to learn more about the world with their neighbors. And I learned there that there is a more equal way to run a society. So the first thing I did was to go out and to work with Mrs. Nanny Yeager to bring kindergarten to Minnesota.
Wow.
And we succeeded.
Wow.
Yes. Thank you. After that, I began the Women's Club. We needed this because we needed a safe place to meet in public. And that is what that afforded us. It wasn't long after that my commitment to women's suffrage began. You see, I had been reading the papers that Norway and Sweden and Finland had already passed the right to vote for women by 1913. I vowed that I would not rest until women in Minnesota and America had the same right to vote. Don't you agree? Well, it has been 100 years that we have been working on this. Nearly 100 years. Obstacle after obstacle, and yet we persist. We have gone to the legislature. I wish I had a penny for every time I submitted a bill for suffrage for women at the Minnesota legislature. And then they threw it in the trash, or they defeated it, or they never voted on it, and I just kept trying. Well, finally, we are getting results, finally. So this has been an opportunity for me to see the power of working together on this and the future. I see the tide beginning to turn for our ship of equal rights, but it has not yet landed in port. There is a lot of disease, there is a lot of war, there is a lot of social unrest. And you know, we are all concerned about this. We are concerned citizens. But if we are concerned citizens, we should be allowed the rights of full citizens. Yes. Do you really believe that men are more intelligent than we are?
Now stop right there. Madam, don't you understand that with all these rallies and events, my children have been denied their mother, and I've been robbed of my wife. All these constant events, it's bad enough that she's neglected us all, but now you have to complement these lists of injuries with this list of insults.
I'm sorry for this disruption of your life, sir, but our movement is very important, and I am sure your daughters will one day thank you and thank us for this very disruption to gain them their freedoms. And you could do some dishes and cleaning.
I know ends of the insults. It's bad enough that we got.
Votes for
How can you
women!
get so
Votes for women! Votes for women! Votes for women!
During the recent Great War in France, President Wilson put our entire national suffrage movement on hold. He said it was unpatriotic. Many of us had marched for peace and avoiding war. We even started the Mother's Day for Peace. When Wilson declared war, he began arresting our pacifist speakers, our peacemakers. Our American women were on the front lines in the recent war in France. They were driving ambulances, working the radio lines, and lives as nurses. In this World War in France, women had those rights, but they didn't have the same rights when they come back to our own country. Is this fair?
No.
Some of our younger women have worked with Alice Paul to begin a more forceful association of women 3 years ago. The National Women's Party in Washington, D.C. They have been pushing boldly forward at the nation's capital. Bertha Moeller is part of this new group and brings us news from the movement in that city.
Yes, I am Bertha Muller. My family is Swedish and has always supported full rights for women. My uncle supported suffrage in the Swedish Parliament. Clara Euland and I have worked together to convince the Minnesota congressional delegates to support the 19th Amendment. And now, the state legislature has passed the amendment. Success! Yes, I have joined the more openly forceful party, the National Women's Party, to work in Washington, D.C. We took to the streets to protest. 168 of us were arrested. We were being jailed for exercising our right of public assembly, which is our right in the Constitution. Perhaps you read in the paper that I have been jailed, arrested 11 times in front of the White House, and I've been jailed twice. During one of those jail terms, I began a hunger strike, just like the brave women in England did. We would rather die than be gagged and speechless. The hunger strike finally brought attention to our cause in the newspapers. They couldn't let us die, so they began to force feed us. Oh, you can't even begin to imagine how painful that is. But worse, how humiliating to be treated like farm animals. Finally, the big city newspapers have brought attention to our demands, and that has brought a giant step forward. Our pain has brought rewards. Congress has finally passed our constitutional amendment for suffrage. 35 states have signed on or ratified this precious document, including Minnesota. We are not finished yet. We still need one more state. Please help us. That's worth applause.
And if you have any relatives in Tennessee or Vermont where just could turn the corner, please write to them. Let them know that we need them to press their legislators to support this in their state. Thank you so much, Bertha. We can't thank you enough for the sacrifice that you made, and that should never have happened just for exercising your rights. Well, now I have the opportunity to introduce another woman who also exercised her rights. She was not only fighting for the right to vote for women, but fighting for rights for her race, the American Indian race. She is a Chippewa Indian woman. She comes from up near Red River, Turtle Mountain, born in 1863, and her name is Mrs. Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin. She has moved with her father to Washington, D.C. They are both lawyers there. She is a remarkable woman. Way too busy to come to our rally, but she has sent us a letter. Perhaps, Mrs. Yeager, will you read it?
I would love to. Dear suffrage sisters, I regret that I cannot join you, but my work in Washington is too pressing right now. You asked that I write about my own life and the struggle for voting rights. When I was born, all the land in the Red River and Pembina area was ours. But when I was 30, our land was threatened by a new treaty. My father, Jean-Baptiste, and I were sent by the Chief Littleshell to Washington, D.C. to get a treaty that in my father's law office, I learned a lot about the law and how Washington affairs worked and often failed. I also learned that understanding the law brings power, and I vowed I'd become a lawyer like him, and I did. I was hired to work for the Office of Indian Affairs in Washington. There I understood that men in this country could vote except Indian men. They were not even citizens. And no woman could vote in the important elections. My father, a lawyer, could not vote, and neither would I as a lawyer. For this reason, I marched in Alice Paul's Great Suffrage Parade of 1913. I was a law student and walked with the other few women law students of Washington College Law School. I was the first woman of color to graduate from there. As I continued to promote the needs of tribes at the Office of Indian Affairs, I helped form the New Society of American Indians in order to fight for citizenship for our people. We patterned this group after the NAACP, developed by colored people. We formed the SAI about 10 years ago, and we are still fighting for citizenship. Yours truly, Mrs. Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin.
And we applaud Mrs. Baldwin in all of her efforts, groundbreaking work that she has done in voting rights and civil rights. This is also true of our next speaker, Mrs. Nellie Griswold Francis, who I know quite well. You may not have read about her in the newspapers, but she has done powerful work in her own St. Paul Rondo neighborhood, as well as on the national stage in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Francis is a star in the suffrage movement, a flame burning with passion for equal rights for her sex as well as her race. Her ruling motive is to help her race, and it is so needed. Please welcome Mrs. Nellie Francis.
Thank you, Mrs. Hewlin. Yes, I am Nellie Griswold Francis, and I started the Every Woman's Suffrage Club in St. Paul, Minnesota. It is the only suffrage club for colored women. There are 50 of us from the Rondo area and beyond, with Mrs. Jordan and Mrs. James at my side. We have done a great work in just 6 years, working for equal rights for women and social justice for the Negro race. The Every Woman's Suffrage Club has employed the arts, song, dance, theater, as a means of getting our message across to every person. I started the folk song Coterie, and this has strengthened our club. I submitted a motion picture to the state fair. This involved many of our local, talented, colored artists who support our message. It was well received. And I really recommend that we continue with the arts to support our cause, our movement. Civil rights has always been a focus of the Black community. As Mary Church Terrell said, we must lift as we climb. Frederick Douglass fought for women's suffrage and for Black suffrage. Next, I will work on Minnesota law against lynching in this state. I don't know if, I'm sure you heard of the horrific lynchings up in Duluth. This cannot happen again. It must not happen again. Votes for women means more justice for us all. I am so grateful to Mrs. Hewlin for supporting our cause. The Minnesota Suffrage Club did not know, the National Suffrage Club did not want to receive colored women in membership. Mrs. Hewlin flat out refused to agree with this. Thank you, Mrs. Hewlin. Thank you, Minnesota. my childhood state of Tennessee, where I will work with legislature to ratify the long-awaited 19th Amendment. It looks promising. It looks promising. And we must all be in this struggle. Poor, rich, colored, white, we are stronger together. Vote for women! Vote for women! Vote for women! Vote for women! Just a little excited.
Yes, Mrs. Francis, we are stronger together. I'm from a Swedish family of Red Wing, and I was the first Scandinavian student to go to the University of Minnesota. I want you to know that Norwegian and Swedish immigrants to our state have been very active in our fight. When Dr. Ethel Edgerton Hurd formed the Scandinavian Women's Suffrage Association, she decided to charge no dues at all. This allowed Norwegian and Swedish immigrant women across Minnesota to be members, rich and poor alike, as Nellie said. I have led this powerful group for 5 years. Minnesota now has a total of 30,000 suffragist members in 6 different organizations, as Miss Hewlin said. Since then, we have fought like soldiers for full citizenship for women. We now need only one more state to ratify the 19th Amendment to make this permanent. Will it be Tennessee? Will it be Vermont? We hope so. Do you have family or friends in these states? Write to them. Go visit them. Soon, Bertha will bring suffrage delegations to speak with 2 nominees for the presidential election about supporting the 19th Amendment. That would be a crucial step. Mrs. Francis and others will be going to Tennessee to confer with citizens and legislators there. Let's take our battle beyond the borders of Minnesota, ladies. We are so very close. Let's sing together one more time. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long.
Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. But the cause goes marching on.
Lights. Camera.
The year is now 1924.
Well, indeed, in 1920, that 19th Amendment did pass in Tennessee. And that has changed everything for us in the past 4 years. But there is quite the story behind it. Let me tell you that story. So, as you can imagine, suffragists from all over the country had descended upon Tennessee. They were convincing legislators for their trying to persuade them and trying to persuade regular people to also call their legislators. As you know, eventually they knew, well, this one is for and this one's against, and they had it all figured out until they realized there was only one undecided. Oh, they were on pins and needles. And that morning, it was man, of course, that morning, his mother sent him a letter, and it said, "Remember the ladies!" And he did. Never underestimate the power of one vote. Yes, yes. Well, in the past 4 years, we have not been sitting around. We have been busy. So Nellie Francis did indeed submit her proposal for the anti-lynching bill for Minnesota, and it passed. And she and all the members of her suffrage group and other women in Rondo all went immediately out to vote, and they have been voting ever since in elections. Success. Then next was Bertha Mueller. Bertha Mueller has continued with Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment, which she crafted. Bertha tells us that she will continue to do this as long as it takes. Mrs. Nanny Yeager has been working ever since on getting rid of child labor in the mines and the factories and some farms so that children can go to school. It is a work in progress. Is this right?
Yes.
Still not decided or approved. I have, since 1919, created the Minnesota Women's League of Voters. Minnesota League of Women Voters. And they are created across the nation, but I am fortunate to be the president of the one in Minnesota and appreciate that. We have more news out of Washington from another person you heard from earlier, Mrs. Marie-Louise Bottineau-Baldwin, sends us a letter of the latest news that she has in 1924.
Dear suffrage sisters, I have news from Washington. For 4 years after the 19th Amendment passed, I still could not vote because I was Indian. But our day of joy has finally come. The Indian Citizenship Act has finally passed Congress this year of 1924. I wonder how many people will be faring in 100 years. Our struggle was against the federal government, who felt that our tribal citizenship would interfere in our civic life in the rest of the country, even when the decisions of that government were about us. Back then, the only way for an Indian to vote was to renounce our tribal status, move away from our people, and take on white people's ways. The war was the turning point. So many of our own warriors joined the military in the recent Great War in France, fighting and dying for our country, that Congress could not refuse our efforts to reward them and all of us with citizenship. Finally, citizenship has come to my people. However, we are concerned that Congress allowed a loophole where an Indian could be denied the vote. Does that mean that some states will deny us the vote? Only time will tell. My best to you, Mrs. Marie-Louise Bottineau-Baldwin.
We thank Mrs. Baldwin for informing us of this very important development. We wish her the best. We wish only the best for all women struggling for rights and those struggling for civil rights. Never forget all the work it took to get us the right to vote. Be sure that you vote, and consult your League of Women Voters for information on voting and on women candidates. Yes, so.
Sexual harassment at work. Equal cost for health insurance. Anything else? Yes, of course. Do you want this too? Tell us. Inexpensive childcare.
Yes.
Equal pay.
Yes.
Be appreciated.
Yes.
Safe workplaces.
Yes.
No sexual abuse.
Yes.
Be respected.
Yes.
If I have to, I can do anything. I am strong. I'm invincible. I am a woman.